The morning sun filtered through the large front windows of the cafe, casting long shadows across the empty tables. The once bustling cafe was now a ghost of its former self, its glory days a distant memory. Maria stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she held the notice from the bank. Her eyes lingered on the bold print. Final notice. The cafe had been her and her late husband's dream, a cozy corner where the townspeople could gather, share stories, and enjoy a cup of coffee. Now, it was crumbling under the weight of unpaid bills. She sighed deeply, her mind racing. Closing the cafe felt like the final nail in the coffin, severing the last tangible connection to her husband, David. It had been a year since he passed, and with each passing day, the cafe seemed to slip further away from her grasp. As Maria placed the notice on the counter, the front door creaked open, and Clara, her teenage daughter, walked in. Her expression was distant, her eyes sharp with the kind of frustration only a teenager could muster. "Mom, we need to talk," Clara said, dropping her school bag near a corner table. "You've seen the bills. You know we can't keep this place open." Maria didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the rows of untouched coffee mugs lining the shelves. She wanted to argue, to tell Clara that everything would be okay, that the cafe would survive somehow. But she couldn't bring herself to say it. Deep down, she knew Clara was right. "I know," Maria finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "But this cafe, it's all I have left of him." Clara softened at her mother's words, but the tension remained. "We can't live off memories, Mom. We need something real, something that works." Before Maria could reply, the bell above the door jingled again. Diego, a local artist and one of the few remaining regulars, stepped inside, his eyes scanning the cafe's empty tables before landing on Maria. "You okay, Maria?" he asked, his voice full of concern as he approached the counter. Maria forced a smile, trying to mask her worry. "Just the usual struggles. How are things with you?" Diego shrugged. "Can't complain, but listen, I've got an idea." He paused, his hands fiddling with the strap of his worn leather satchel. "What if we turned the cafe into something more? A gallery of sorts. I could display my art here, host events, bring people in. It might just be enough to give the place a little life again." Maria blinked, surprised by the offer. She hadn't considered that the cafe could be more than it was. But could art really save it? Clara, listening from the side, scoffed. "An art gallery? How is that going to pay the bills?" Diego shot Clara a knowing glance. "It's about drawing people in, Clara. Once people start coming for the art, they'll stay for the coffee. It's worth a shot." Maria looked between her daughter and Diego, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Maybe Diego was onto something. "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "Let's try it." Diego's face lit up with enthusiasm as Maria agreed to his idea, while Clara's arms remained crossed in defiance. "I'll get started on setting everything up," he said, pulling out his sketch pad and flipping through his designs. "I can hang a few pieces by the end of the week, and maybe we can host a small gallery night. Just something to bring people in, see if we can catch their interest." Maria nodded, though a part of her still hesitated. This wasn't the cafe she and David had built. Could it even survive such a drastic shift in direction? Clara's voice cut through her thoughts. "Mom, you can't seriously think this will work. Do you have a better idea?" Maria asked, her voice firmer than she'd intended. Clara's eyes widened at the rare edge in her mother's tone, and she fell silent, retreating back to the window to watch the deserted street outside. Maria exhaled softly and turned to Diego. "Let's start small. A few pieces and we'll see how it goes." The following days were a blur of preparation. Diego spent hours hanging his paintings, carefully placing each one in the best light. The cafe took on a new atmosphere, one that felt both familiar and foreign to Maria. The walls, once bare, now held bursts of color, landscapes, portraits, and abstract images, each telling its own story. As the transformation unfolded, Maria tried to push aside her doubts. The cafe was no longer just hers. It was becoming something new, something she wasn't sure she understood. And yet, as she watched Diego arrange his final piece, there was a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. On the night of the gallery event, Maria's nerves were in overdrive. The small chalkboard outside the cafe advertised gallery night, and Diego had spread the word among his fellow artists. But as the sun began to set, the tables inside remained empty. Maria paced behind the counter, glancing at the clock. Clara sat at the far end of the cafe, her phone in hand, scrolling through social media with disinterest. Diego said people would come. Maria muttered under her breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. Just as doubt began to consume her, the bell above the door rang, and two figures entered. Diego, with a wide smile, led the way, followed by a young couple dressed in casual but trendy clothing. "Told you we'd get a crowd," Diego said with a wink. It wasn't exactly a crowd, but it was a start. Soon, a few more people trickled in, artists, curious locals, and a couple of Maria's regulars. They wandered a cafe, sipping coffee and admiring Diego's work. The buzz of quiet conversation filled the space, and for the first time in months, the cafe felt alive. Clara, still skeptical, watched from the corner, but even she couldn't deny the subtle change in the atmosphere. The cafe wasn't bustling, but it wasn't empty either. As the night wound down and the last guests departed, Diego approached Maria. "It wasn't a bad turnout for the first night," he said, his optimism unwavering. Maria smiled, though exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. "No, it wasn't bad," she admitted, glancing around the cafe. The paintings remained on the walls, and the energy of the evening still lingered in the air. But Maria knew they would need more than just a few curious art lovers to keep the cafe alive. This was only the beginning. The morning after the gallery event, Maria stood behind the counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. She stared at the paintings still hanging on the walls, each one vibrant and full of life. It had been a small success, but success nonetheless. Diego had been right about the potential to draw in new people. Still, it felt fragile, like one gust of wind could knock everything down. Clara shuffled into the cafe, rubbing her eyes, clearly not a morning person. She looked around, her face showing no signs of being impressed by last night's turnout. "So, are you going to tell me how many customers you actually got last night, or are you just going to pretend it was a huge hit?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Maria sighed, setting down her cup. "It wasn't packed, but we had more people than usual. And that's something." Clara rolled her eyes, grabbing a chair and plopping herself down at one of the tables. "That's not going to pay the bills, Mom." "I know that, Clara," Maria snapped, the frustration in her voice surprising even her. She wasn't used to raising her voice, especially not at her daughter. But the tension of the situation was becoming too much to bear. Clara blinked, taken aback by her mother's sudden sharpness, but she quickly recovered, her voice softening slightly. "I'm just saying, it's not sustainable. We can't live off hope." Maria sank into a chair opposite her daughter. She knew Clara was right, and the reality of their situation was starting to weigh heavily on her. Diego's gallery event had been a nice distraction, but the cafe's financial troubles hadn't disappeared overnight. The bank still expected payments, and the notice on the counter was a constant reminder of that looming deadline. As they sat in silence, the bell above the door jingled, and Diego strode in, his usual upbeat energy filling the room. "Morning, ladies. How are we feeling after our little soiree last night?" Clara shot him a skeptical glance, but Maria forced a smile. "It went well, I think. People seemed to enjoy it." Diego plopped down in a chair next to them, completely oblivious to the tension between mother and daughter. "Well, I've got some ideas to keep the momentum going. If we did a regular event, like a weekly gallery night or something, we can invite other local artists, maybe even do live music. People love that kind of stuff." Maria hesitated, the thought of turning the cafe into an event space feeling foreign and unsettling. "I'm not sure. This place, it was never supposed to be that." Clara scoffed, leaning back in her chair. It was never supposed to fail either, but here we are. The words hit Maria like a punch in the gut. She looked at Diego, whose expression had grown serious. Maria, I know it's not what you and David planned, but maybe that's okay. Maybe the cafe needs to evolve. Maria's gaze drifted to the painting hanging on the wall closest to her, a vivid scene of a sunflower field, bright and hopeful. The cafe was changing, whether she liked it or not. And maybe, just maybe, she needed to change with it. All right, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Let's try it. A weekly event. Diego's grin returned, lighting up his entire face. You won't regret it, Maria. Trust me, we'll make this place the talk of the town. Clara crossed her arms, still unconvinced. And what if it doesn't work? What's your backup plan then? Diego didn't miss a beat. Then we come up with something else. The important thing is to keep trying. As the weeks passed, the cafe slowly began to take on a new identity. Diego's idea for weekly gallery nights brought in a small but steady stream of customers. Some came for the art, others for the coffee, and a few stayed for both. It wasn't a packed house by any means, but for the first time in months, there was a sense of movement, of possibility. Maria found herself settling into the rhythm of these new events. She even began to look forward to them, despite her initial hesitation. The cafe was buzzing with life again, even if it was just a faint hum compared to the roar it once was. Each Thursday evening, Diego would set up his latest works, rearranging the paintings to keep things fresh. He invited other local artists to showcase their pieces, and soon the walls were filled with a rotating gallery of different styles and visions. Clara, meanwhile, remained on the sidelines, watching it all unfold with a skeptical eye. She wasn't against the idea anymore, but she wasn't convinced it would save the cafe either. To her, it all felt like a temporary fix to a much bigger problem. Still, there was a part of her that admired her mother's resilience, even if she couldn't say it out loud. One evening, as Maria wiped down the counter after a particularly quiet gallery night, Diego sat at one of the tables, sketching in his notebook. The cafe was empty now, save for the two of them. You know, Diego said, not looking up from his sketch, I've been thinking about adding something new to the events. Something that'll really draw people in. Maria paused, glancing at him. Like what? Music, he said, his pencil moving swiftly across the page. Live performances. We could have local musicians come in and play during the gallery nights. It'll add a whole new dimension to the atmosphere. Maria's brow furrowed. Music. I don't know, Diego. That seems like a lot. It's not, Diego insisted. We wouldn't need to do anything crazy. Just a simple setup, maybe a guitarist or singer-songwriter. People love that kind of thing. Maria bit her lip, considering it. The cafe had already undergone so many changes in the past few weeks. What was one more? But something about the idea made her uneasy, as if it would push the cafe further away from what it had once been. I'll think about it, she said finally, though the doubt was clear in her voice. Diego looked up from his sketchbook, his expression serious for once. Maria, I know this isn't what you and David planned, but you've got to stop thinking about what it used to be and start thinking about what it could be. Maria's heart clenched at the mention of David's name. It had been over a year since he passed, but the pain still felt fresh. She wasn't sure she could let go of the cafe's original vision without feeling like she was letting go of him, too. Diego seemed to sense her hesitation and softened his tone. Just think about it. We don't have to rush into anything. Maria nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts of the past and the future. The cafe had changed, but was she ready to change with it? As the weeks went by, the cafe's new identity seemed to solidify, but so did Maria's internal struggles. The gallery nights, now a regular feature, had managed to draw in more customers, yet it still wasn't enough to fully turn the business around. Each time Maria glanced at the bank's letter, still sitting in a drawer behind the counter, she felt the weight of her reality pressing down. The cafe wasn't failing as quickly as before, but the debts were piling up nonetheless. One afternoon, while the cafe was quiet, Maria sat alone at one of the tables, her mind spinning with numbers and unpaid bills. Clara walked in, taking a seat across from her. She hadn't been involved in the gallery nights much, but she always stayed nearby, observing her mother's efforts from a distance. "You're worrying again," Clara said flatly, noticing the drawn look on Maria's face. Maria sighed, not bothering to deny it. "We're doing better, but it's still not enough. The bank, they'll come for the cafe if we don't start making larger payments soon." Clara fiddled with her phone, not meeting her mother's gaze. "So what are you going to do?" Maria hesitated. She hadn't shared everything with Clara. She hadn't told her about the mortgage that David had secretly taken out just before he passed. The cafe's financial troubles weren't just a result of the dwindling customers. It was a weight that Maria hadn't been prepared for. "I don't know," Maria admitted, her voice heavy. "There's more debt than I realized. David, he didn't tell me everything." Clara's eyes shot up, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "He took out a second mortgage on the cafe," Maria said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know about it until after he was gone. Now the bank is breathing down my neck, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold them off." Clara was silent for a long moment, processing the information. "So, what happens if you can't pay off?" Maria's face tightened, and her throat felt dry as she answered, "We lose the cafe." Clara sat back in her chair, the weight of her mother's words settling in. She had always been critical of her mother's decision to keep the cafe running, but now, understanding the full scope of the situation, her cynicism began to fade. This wasn't just about holding on to the past, it was about survival. As the tension hung in the air between them, the bell over the door rang, and Diego entered, his usual energy seeming almost intrusive in the heavy silence. "Hey, Maria, Clara," he greeted, his bright smile faltering when he sensed the mood. "Everything okay?" Maria forced a smile, trying to push the conversation with Clara aside. "Yeah, Diego. Just thinking." Diego approached, his eyes flicking between them, but choosing not to press. "I've been thinking about the music idea. I know it's a lot, but I really think it could make a difference. If we host some live performances, we could bring in a whole new crowd." Maria glanced at Clara, who was still deep in thought. The idea of adding yet another layer to the cafe's transformation felt overwhelming. But at this point, what did they have to lose? "Let's try it," Maria said finally, surprising even herself with the decisiveness in her voice. "We need something more, and if music can bring people in, then we'll give it a shot." Diego grinned, the tension in the room lightening slightly. "I'll start reaching out to some musicians. You won't regret it." As Diego began preparing for the cafe's first music night, Maria noticed something unexpected. Clara had started spending more time in the cafe. It wasn't that she was suddenly enthusiastic about the business, but she lingered, watching her mother and Diego work with a growing sense of curiosity. Maria couldn't remember the last time they'd shared more than a few words without an argument, but now there was an unspoken truce between them. One afternoon, as Maria wiped down tables and Diego set up the makeshift stage for the upcoming music night, Clara sat quietly in the corner, sketching on a pad of paper. "You're drawing again," Maria said softly, passing by with a tray of clean mugs. Clara glanced up, shrugging. "It's something to do." Maria smiled slightly, though she didn't press the matter. Clara had always been a talented artist, but after her father's death, she had stopped drawing almost entirely. Seeing her daughter's fingers moving deftly over the page stirred a warmth in Maria's chest, even if she didn't say it aloud. As the first music night approached, the cafe buzzed with a nervous energy. Diego had managed to secure a local singer-songwriter, and word had spread among the town's artistic community. The turnout wasn't guaranteed, but Maria could feel the excitement building. On the evening of the performance, Clara hovered near the counter, pretending to help her mother, but clearly more interested in watching the event unfold. The small stage was set, the lights dimmed just enough to create an intimate atmosphere. Customers began trickling in, some of them regulars, others new faces drawn by the promise of live music. Diego moved around the cafe, greeting people and ensuring everything was in order. When performer finally took the stage, the hum of conversation quieted, and the cafe filled with the soft strumming of a guitar. The music was gentle, filling the space with warmth, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of peace. Clara, seated near the back, listened intently, her sketchbook resting on her lap. She glanced around at the crowd, noticing how different the cafe felt now, how alive it seemed. The people were engaged, not just with the music, but with the cafe itself, as if they were rediscovering it for the first time. As the night wore on, the performance drew to a close, and Maria stood behind the counter, her heart light for the first time in months. The cafe wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. It felt possible. After the last customer left, and the cafe quieted once more, Clara approached Maria, her sketchbook still in hand. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Ma, I was thinking, maybe I could help out with these events more," she said, her voice tentative. "I mean, I could design posters or something, you know, to promote the next one." Maria's heart swelled at the offer, though she kept her tone calm. "That would be great, Clara. I'd love that." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "Okay, I'll start working on something tomorrow." For the first time, in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of connection between them. The cafe was changing, and maybe, just maybe, their relationship was too. The cafe was buzzing with energy as the day of the art festival arrived. Diego had outdone himself, organizing local artists, setting up booths outside the cafe, and even arranging live performances to complement the event. Maria stood behind the counter, watching as the streets filled with people. For the first time in a long while, the cafe felt like it was part of something bigger than itself. Clara was busy hanging up the final posters she had designed. Her eye for detail was undeniable, and her posters, vibrant with bold colors and playful fonts, gave the festival a fresh and inviting look. Maria couldn't help but feel proud of her daughter. Clara had been more involved lately, and it had been a long time since Maria had seen her so engaged in something. Diego darted in and out of the cafe, checking on the artists, ensuring the booths were set up correctly, and encouraging passers-by to stop by the cafe for coffee and snacks. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon enough, the cafe was filled with customers, more than Maria had seen in months. Clara walked over to Maria, her expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "This might actually work, Mom." Maria smiled at her, though beneath her joy, there was a lingering sense of dread. The cafe was packed, and the festival was drawing a crowd, but in the back of her mind, the bank's looming presence was still there. She couldn't shake the fear that, no matter how well the festival went, it might not be enough to save the cafe. Throughout the afternoon, the festival grew busier. The local artists were selling their work, and the streets echoed with laughter and conversation. Maria floated between serving customers, chatting with festival goers, and watching Clara and Diego run around, managing the chaos with a surprising level of calm. However, just as the event seemed to be reaching its peak, a car pulled up to the cafe, and two men in suits stepped out. Maria recognized them immediately. One of them was Mr. Ramos, the bank's representative, and his presence felt like a punch to the gut. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Mr. Ramos's stern face didn't change as he greeted her. "Mrs. Silva, we need to speak," he said, his voice cold and businesslike. Maria's stomach dropped. "Can't wait. We're in the middle of an event." "I'm afraid it can't. We've come to discuss the matter of your payments," Mr. Ramos replied, his tone making it clear that this wasn't negotiable. Maria glanced around the cafe. The last thing she wanted was to deal with this in the middle of what should have been a triumphant moment. "Can we do this somewhere private?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. Mr. Ramos nodded, and Maria led him and his colleague to a small corner in the back of the cafe, away from the bustling crowd. She knew what was coming. The bank had been patient, but their patience had its limits. "We've reviewed your account, Mrs. Silva," Mr. Ramos said, flipping open his briefcase and pulling out some paperwork. "Unfortunately, your payments have fallen significantly behind. If you're unable to make a substantial payment soon, we'll have no choice but to proceed with the foreclosure." Maria's head spun. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel like the walls were closing in. I've been trying," she stammered, her hands shaking. "Business has been picking up, but it's still not enough. We just need more time." Mr. Ramos remained unmoved. "Time is a luxury we can't afford. I'm sorry, Mrs. Silva, but the bank is prepared to move forward unless a significant payment is made within the next week." A week. That was all she had. Maria felt her knees go weak. Everything she had worked for, everything she and David had built together, it could all be gone in a matter of days. "Isn't there anything we can do?" Maria asked, her voice cracking with desperation. "We have this festival today, and it's bringing in money. Maybe if we just had a little more time." Mr. Ramos shook his head. "I'm afraid the bank's position is clear. 1 week, Mrs. Silva." As they left, Maria stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise of the festival around her seemed distant, muffled by the crushing weight of the ultimatum. 1 week. It wasn't enough time. As evening fell, the art festival began to wind down. The streets, once bustling with activity, were quieting, and the cafe was nearly empty. Diego was helping some of the artists pack up their booths, and Clara was cleaning up inside. But Maria was numb, sitting at one of the tables, her hands gripping a piece of paper that felt heavier than it should have. The ultimatum from the bank replayed in her mind over and over again. 1 week to come up with the money or lose the cafe. Maria felt trapped, cornered by forces outside of her control. She had given everything to keep the cafe running, but now it seemed like it wasn't enough. Clara approached, her brow furrowed. "Mom, you okay?" Maria blinked, looking up at her daughter. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she handed Clara the paper, the letter from the bank. Clara's eyes scanned a document, her expression turning from confusion to shock. "They're going to take the cafe," she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Maria nodded, her throat tight. "Unless we can come up with the money." Clara stood silent for a moment, processing the reality of the situation. Then, to Maria's surprise, her expression hardened with resolve. "We're not going to let that happen." Maria gave her a sad smile. "I don't know if we have a choice, Clara. I don't have anything left to sell." Clara's face lit up suddenly, as if an idea had struck her. "What about Dad's collection?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. David's prized collection of rare coffee memorabilia, something he had spent years building, something that had meant the world to him. She had kept it stored away, a reminder of the passion he had for the cafe, for their dream. Selling it felt like betraying his memory, like giving up on everything he had worked for. "I don't know," Maria said, her voice trembling. "That was your father's. It was his legacy. And this cafe is part of his legacy too," Clara argued. "Dad wouldn't want us to lose everything. Maybe selling the collection is what we need to do to save the cafe." Maria's chest tightened. Clara's words made sense, but the thought of parting with David's collection was almost unbearable. She had already lost so much. Could she lose this too? Clara knelt beside her, her eyes full of determination. "Mom, you've worked too hard to let this place go. Dad loved this cafe, but he loved us more. He would want us to fight for it." Tears pricked at the corners of Maria's eyes. She knew Clara was right. David wouldn't have wanted her to sacrifice everything for a collection of coffee memorabilia, no matter how much he had cherished it. But letting go felt like losing him all over again. After a long silence, Maria nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Okay, we'll sell the collection." Clara hugged her tightly, and Maria allowed herself to be comforted by the strength of her daughter. They would sell David's collection. It was their only chance to save the cafe. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Maria, with Clara's help, carefully cataloged David's coffee memorabilia, vintage espresso machines, rare coffee grinders, and antique cups from around the world. Each item held sentimental value, but Maria knew it was their only hope. Clara had been right. David wouldn't have wanted them to lose everything just to hold on to relics of the past. The night before the auction, Maria sat in the cafe, staring at the collection now displayed in the front window. Diego was finishing setting up the space for the final music night before the auction. He could sense Maria's unease. "You're doing the right thing," Diego said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This isn't about letting go of David. It's about keeping his dream alive." Maria nodded, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. She had to keep reminding herself that this was for the cafe, for her family's future. But the thought of strangers bidding on the pieces that David had so lovingly curated felt like tearing away a piece of her heart. The next morning, the cafe was transformed into an auction house. Local auctioneers arrived early to set up, while Clara and Maria arranged the memorabilia on tables, each item carefully labeled. Word had spread about the auction, and by mid-afternoon, people were trickling in to browse the collection before the bidding began. Maria tried to stay busy, serving coffee to the guests, but every glance at the items up for auction twisted her stomach. Diego hovered nearby, managing the crowd and offering support whenever he could. Clara, surprisingly calm, helped usher in curious buyers, her determination giving Maria a small glimmer of hope. As the auction began, the room filled with a quiet intensity. The auctioneer took his place at the front, and with a booming voice, began listing the items one by one. The bidding started slow, numbers far too low to cover what Maria owed the bank. Her heart sank as the first few pieces sold for less than she'd hoped. Each bid brought her closer to the edge, and she couldn't shake the feeling that all of this might be for nothing. When they reached the more valuable items in the collection, the bidding picked up, but it still wasn't enough. Maria clenched her fists, fighting the urge to panic. What if they couldn't raise the money? What if the cafe was doomed, no matter how much they sold? Then, just as the last and most valuable piece, a rare antique espresso machine, was brought to the front, a familiar face entered the cafe. Maria's breath caught in her throat as a tall, well-dressed man stepped inside. It was Mr. Stevenson, one of David's old friends and a regular at the cafe during its early days. Maria hadn't seen him in years, but he had always been an avid supporter of David's passion for coffee and the cafe they had built together. The bidding for the espresso machine began, and for a moment, it seemed as though the crowd had lost interest. But then Mr. Stevenson raised his hand. $1,000, he called out, his voice steady. The room fell silent. Maria's heart leapt. It was more than any of the other items had sold for so far. The auctioneer's hammer hovered above the podium, going once, going twice. A voice in the back called out, raising the bid, but Mr. Stevenson didn't hesitate. $1,500. Maria watched in disbelief as the back and forth bidding continued, but Mr. Stevenson wasn't giving up. With each raise, his determination grew, and finally, when the bidding reached $2,000, the hammer came down. Sold. The room erupted into applause, but all Maria could feel was the immense weight lifting from her shoulders. It wasn't the full amount they needed, but it was enough to give her a fighting chance. After the auction ended, Mr. Stevenson approached Maria with a warm smile. David loved this place. He would have wanted it to stay in the family. Maria, overwhelmed with gratitude, hugged him tightly. "Thank you. You've saved us." Mr. Stevenson shook his head. "You and Clara saved yourselves. I just did what I could." With the auction success behind them, Maria, Clara, and Diego gathered in the cafe the next morning. The collection had sold for more than they expected, and though it wasn't enough to erase all the cafe's debt, it was enough to delay foreclosure and give them a real chance to turn things around. The cafe felt different now, not because it was saved, but because it felt like the start of something new. Clara had designed new posters for the cafe, advertising the weekly events they were hosting, gallery nights, live music, and now a new feature, an open mic night where locals could share their talents. Diego had already lined up musicians and poets eager to participate. As Maria prepared coffee for the day's first customers, she glanced over at Clara, who was busy setting up for the next gallery night. Clara had become more than just her daughter. She was her partner in this fight to save the cafe. Maria had never been more proud. When Clara finished hanging the last of the new posters, she approached Maria with a shy smile. "So, I've been thinking, maybe we should rename the cafe. You know, give it a fresh start. Maria blinked in surprise. Rename it. Yeah, Clara said, her eyes bright. Dad loved coffee, but he loved art and music too. I think we should make the cafe reflect all of that, everything it's become. We can honor his memory while still moving forward. Maria felt a lump rise in her throat. Clara's words were a perfect reflection of what Maria had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. The cafe wasn't just about David anymore. It was about their future. What do you want to call it? Maria asked, her voice soft. Clara thought for a moment, then smiled. How about the Art of Coffee? Maria's heart swelled. It was perfect. It captured everything they had worked for, the blend of art, music, and the community that had come together to keep the cafe alive. I love it, Maria said, her eyes shining. The Art of Coffee it is. As they worked to change the sign outside the cafe, Diego joined them, helping to paint the new name in bold, colorful letters. The transformation was symbolic of the journey they had all been on, the struggle, the sacrifices, and the hope that had brought them to this moment. When the sign was finally up, Maria stepped back, taking it all in. The cafe was no longer the place it had been when she and David first opened it. It had evolved, just as she had, and though the future was still uncertain, for the first time in a long while, Maria felt ready to face whatever came next. That evening, as the cafe filled with people for the gallery night, Maria watched with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The place was alive again, buzzing with conversation, laughter, and creativity. Clara was at the front, chatting with a group of young artists, and Diego was busy coordinating the music lineup for the next performance. As Maria poured herself a cup of coffee and looked around the room, she realized something important. The cafe wasn't just saved. It was thriving. It had become more than a business. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and of the power of reinvention. The Art of Coffee had found its place in the town, and Maria had found her place within it. Together, they were creating something beautiful, something lasting. And that, Maria thought with a smile, was worth everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more heartwarming tales. We'd love to know what part of the story impacted you the most. Was it the perseverance of Maria, Clara's growing involvement, or perhaps the transformation of the cafe? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're here, we'd love to hear your story suggestions. What kinds of stories would you like to see next? Share your ideas with us. And who knows, your suggestion might just inspire our next video. Thank you for being a part of our community.